Okay, so welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And I'm very privileged to be joined today by Professor Alan Lester, who's a professor of historical geography at Sussex University. We're here really to talk about the question of current debates around empire. And how we have that conversation during a period of what you could call culture war. Which again is a sort of an oft-used term that I think has become almost sort of slightly kind of mythologized in certain ways. These sort of strange, overused terminologies. But anyway, firstly, welcome, Alan. It's a pleasure to have you. Perhaps we can begin. You're currently, or in the near future, going to be running a workshop, aren't you, on the culture wars and the sort of the understanding of empire. Perhaps you can tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me in the first place, Nick. It's a real pleasure, and I'm flattered to be here talking to you. I'm running a summer school, we're calling it, at Sussex University, where I work, on the 22nd of August. And it's called How to Talk About the British Colonialism in the Middle of a Culture War. And a few years ago, I would never have dreamed of holding such a summer school and inventing such a title. But the background to it is that my area of specialism, I've been working for over 30 years now on aspects of British colonialism as a professional academic, mostly 19th century. Largely, as far as sort of popular history is concerned, a relative backwater. Until really first of all, the Rhodes Must Fall campaign of anti-racist activists spread from University of Cape Town to Oxford University, and there was a controversy over the statue of Rhodes above the entrance to Oriel College in Oxford. That was 2015. And then 2020, the Black Lives Matter protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd in the US. And those things started to render the record of British colonialism, the history of British colonialism, something of a major public controversy, a kind that was unprecedented. And the reason really for that, well, two things I think were happening. One was that Black Lives Matter activists were drawing attention to the often unspoken, hidden histories of colonialism. When they targeted the statue of Edward Colston, known as a philanthropist in Bristol, but known to others as a man who made his fortune through the slave trade, they were drawing our attention to aspects of Britain's colonial past, which are often unspoken, often sort of buried, and drawing attention to the legacies of the kind of racial views, the racial exploitation upon which so much of British colonial activity depended. And I think what happened immediately was a backlash against that very act of drawing attention to this history, this largely sort of obscured, unadmitted history. And that backlash took the form of culture war. So we have to go back a little, I think, to understand how culture war was already a kind of a political mechanism, a political apparatus, upon which some, not by no means all, but some conservative elements seized in this backlash against Black Lives Matter. I think culture war as a phenomenon really was first written about in the context of 1960s America, USA. And it was largely a term to describe a kind of constellation of conservative and often religious groups, both Christian and Jewish largely, who objected to the social changes that were occurring in the USA during the 60s, greater secularization of society, civil rights movement and feminist movement were main sort of targets. And what you began to see in the 60s in America was these conservative groups defining all of this range of sort of progressive social change as a dangerous, threatening form of liberalism, which destabilize American society. traditional, largely white American society.
Yes, you can
So
see
instead of
I was going to say, there's a point, isn't there, probably about 1966, 67, when you have people like William F. Buckley and people like that who are very, I mean, and that when you read what they say, they're very explicit. They're very conscious of fighting some kind of campaign to sort of save America, or save the version of America that they wish to exist.
Yeah, absolutely. And people like that are crucial in sort of defining what's now known as the woke, as some kind of almost an anonymous existential threat to the nation. Rather than just disparate groups of people who are fighting for different kinds of reform. They're kind of lumped together to become this us or them existential threat, and you can't compromise with them. You can't debate with them. They threaten to undermine the very basis of your existence, and so they have to be dismissed. And woke is the term that's currently used for this kind of threat by the right-wing press here in particular, who are helping elements within the current Conservative government to sponsor this culture war. And I think that culture war approach to politics was really deepened in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, the banking crisis, which saw a great polarization of wealth and opportunity, and which enabled some fairly narcissistic politicians, Trump on one side of the Atlantic, and I think Boris Johnson on this side too, to see an opportunity of mobilizing a base which was anti-woke, and which was fueled by this kind of sense of a binary division in politics between the liberal in America, the woke here, and sort of traditional values of conservatives, and which started to mobilize a kind of culture war rhetoric of this woke otherness. And that was already sort of underway, I think, when Black Lives Matter occurred. And after the toppling of Colston's statue, you see that kind of anti-woke rhetoric being wielded against the protesters who toppled Colston's statue. And the reaction from Boris Johnson's government was immediate. His ministers were talking about trashing Britain's past, stopping the woke from trashing Britain's past, protecting statues from these woke militant mobs. Even only one statue that was actually toppled. And all of this was happening at a time when I was sort of out of normal academic circulation. I was in hospital having a liver transplant at the time. And I was thinking, well, this is relating to work that I've done over the last 30 years. I know a bit about the British Empire, and I just didn't recognize that empire from the kind of conservative narratives of defense of Britishness, these kind of hyper-nationalist narratives that were suddenly being popularized again. And I thought, well, I'll use this opportunity when I'm out of sort of normal academic research and I can't go into the archives and do things, to kind of wield what knowledge I have accumulated over the last 30 years to try to give a more sort of academically nuanced, a more rigorous, a more truthful account to combat some of the most egregious misrepresentations of Britain's past. I wrote a book called Deny and Disavow, largely while I was in hospital, which tried to address the way in which the imperial past was being distorted as part of this backlash against anti-racist movements. And all the time that I was writing, I was having to continually update it because the kind of assault, the cultural assault was ongoing, and manifested in various ways, which we can maybe talk a little bit more about. But a long-winded way of saying basically that this workshop that I'm putting on the summer school is designed to help an increasing number of people, I think, who feel uncertain and a bit insecure about aspects of their job when it may involve talking about the colonial past. So I'm thinking of heritage professionals, people from bodies like National Trust, which has been a particular target in the culture. English heritage, some journalists, school teachers as well, who would like to be able to teach more about colonialism. Still a relatively neglected area of our curriculum, but who are wary of what can be said and what can't be said on the basis of evidence, and would like to hear from someone who's dedicated their career to understand this stuff. So that's where it came from. Yeah.
For listeners internationally, and I think probably about 2/3 of the people that listen to this podcast aren't in the UK. Perhaps it would be useful just to talk a bit about the issues between reclaim history, this group of kind of reactionary historians that has formed itself, and the National Trust. There might even be people listening who aren't really aware of what the National Trust is, but this has been a kind of a key battleground, hasn't it, in the last few years?
Yeah, there's two overlapping lobby groups now, actually both registered as private companies, who have relatively obscure sort of funding. A lot of people think that they are funded through a kind of network of right-wing lobbying groups based around an address in London called 55 Tufton Street, where a number of think tanks, very conservative, nationalistic think tanks, are based and funded by conservative-leaning millionaires, businessmen of various kinds. Two of these groups were formed in the wake of Black Lives Matter. One was called History Reclaimed, which is largely a website which draws together purportedly historians trying to combat the revision of imperial and colonial history, trying to prevent the uncovering of obscured histories of British colonial racism, British colonial violence, British colonial oppression. So they're trying to put a lid on what can be said about those things, and dismissing any work by activists and historians, professional historians, which draws attention to these more challenging aspects of Britain's past. They're trying to combat that by dismissing it as part of a woke conspiracy, an unrealistic approach to history, condemning it as postmodern Marxism. So various lines of attack, essentially to try to defend a much older understanding of empire generated as imperial propaganda in Britain, basically from the 19th century onwards, that empire was justified, that it was part of a civilizing mission, that it did more good than harm, that we need to see it in a kind of balanced sheet way where, okay, there were some atrocities, there was some oppression, but overall it did the world a favor. It's all those kinds of narratives that they want to cling on to, even in the face of verifiable historical evidence about the degree of racial exploitation and violence that was actually involved in colonialism. Yeah. So History Reclaimed is a kind of website which upholds that more traditional version of the past and tries to combat revisions of it. Then there's an overlapping group, overlapping in terms of membership and probably funding, although we don't really know, it's all very shady and obscured, called Restore Trust. And Restore Trust specifically targets the National Trust. And this is a body often seen in the past as a very sort of conservative body, which protects and preserves heritage, largely rural countryside, but also stately homes, manor houses. Many of its properties belonged to members of the British elite through modern history. And the reason the National Trust has come in for criticism is that it commissioned a report which was led by a professor from Leicester, Corinne Fowler, to find out more, basically just to find out more empirically about what role colonial wealth and wealth derived from slavery had played in the development of its properties. And the report was quite empirically based. It was quite factual, quite neutral in its tone. And you can go through it, it's online. You can find house by house, property by property, if there was any role. And about a third of the properties were identified as having some kind of connection to the colonial past, ownership through their funding and so on. And you can go through and see what those connections were. But as the report was published, it immediately became the target for this kind of politicized culture war attack on so-called wokery. And the National Trust was condemned for selling out to wokery. And it's the author of the report, Corinne Fowler, came in for quite a lot of abuse. including threats after the Daily Mail in particular initiated a campaign against the report. Restore Trust was founded by some disaffected members and people who weren't members but who joined specifically to back Restore Trust. Twice now it has tried to get its own candidates elected to the National Trust Council so that they can prevent the National Trust from doing any more of this work of heritage interpretation and prevent it informing visitors, members and the public more about the role of colonialism and slavery in its properties development. So they don't object to the National Trust highlighting stories of the oppression of English rural workers or the working classes. They don't object to historical narratives about how the architecture was developed or the landscapes were gardened or landscapes were planned. Don't object to histories of the furniture and the tapestries and so on. But what they do object to is anything which draws attention to colonial racial exploitation and slavery. And they've got a lot of backing, as History Reclaimed has, in Parliament, among the more right-wing, Brexiteering, conservative members of Parliament, a group called the Common Sense group of MPs, which we could come back to maybe later, and a lot of backing in the right-wing press. So the Daily Telegraph and its former editor, Charles Moore, are particular backers of both groups, the Mail and the Express, and also the Spectator magazine. These tend to be the main mouthpieces. So they're well-resourced, seem to be relatively well-funded. They have a very prominent national platform, and yet the irony is that they claim to have been silenced or cancelled by woke culture.
Well, here you have it. There's this sort of assumption that the whole kind of basis of culture war seems to be about the appropriation of victimhood, normally by the more powerful side of the argument, or the more powerful group, anyway. And the idea that, firstly, we're being persecuted. So there's almost something sort of Stalinist happening here about us being silenced. Unless you have carte blanche to say things which are, ahistorical or untrue, that there's some kind of sinister force silencing you. But also there is this, and I think this is almost like a more Fox News type thing. There's this kind of almost sort of conspiracy theory level paranoia that the very foundations of who we are as a people are about to be wiped out by some kind of left-wing academics and journalists and people that read a bit of Adorno at university and that kind of thing, and of course it's like ridiculous, but there is obviously always a little bit of buy-in from certain people, certain members of the public who perhaps know nothing else about it. I guess one of my things that I've wondered is this: there's this idea, and it's obviously it's a fallacy. And you anyone that's done kind of an introductory to historical methods on a BA course at university would know this. The idea that history is a kind of like a settled matter, that we've had a look at the past, and some various clever Victorians wrote some books, and it's all done. We don't need to kind of go back there. And you have some of the most some really eminent names in kind of modern academic and popular British history writing, essentially saying this and saying new things we think about slavery or new things we think about colonialism we shouldn't be entertained, which to me sounds like the worst abrogation of academic kind of ethics and responsibilities, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of things going on. There's shifts in historiography, which nationalists tend to find disturbing, not just in Britain but everywhere. Challenges to national myths. And nationalists always have myths that their nation has behaved honourably, by and large, in the past. And over the last sort of few decades, the historiography has been shifting away from the justifications, the self-justifications for empire that tended to characterise much British history writing about empire. And history emerged as a profession in the late 19th century with people writing about why the empire should matter more to Britain. So I'm thinking of Seeley here, for instance, and people like Froude writing about how English people needed to think much more seriously about the colonizing project and about creating an Anglo-Saxon world and the virtue of doing so. So these were justificatory explanations of empire, analyses of empire, and even advocacy for empire. And that was the sort of beginnings of the historiography of empire in Britain. And even through to the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, most British historians of empire were concerned with questions about how Britain came to acquire such a large empire, how they managed to administer it, and why it was eventually lost. They weren't concerned with questions of how empire was experienced from the other side, as it were. And they weren't concerned with transformations of the globe and of culture and of politics around the world that empire saw to. And it was really from the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s onwards that the historiography began to shift, not least because of post-colonial critics and writers, people like Ibn Said, Palestinian origin, Homi Bhabha, Gayatri Spivak from India, starting to write about other ways of looking at the empire, not just the sort of self-justificatory ways from the ruler's perspective. Also had people like Eric Williams, the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, a black man writing history back to Britain and saying how slavery had been one of the bases of Britain's industrial revolution, the extraction of wealth through slavery. And subsequently, quite a lot of work has been done, particularly at the UCL, Legacies of British Slavery Centre, which has vindicated much, not all, but much of what Williams was arguing, that the wealth extracted from slave ownership did play a role, a quite significant role, in jump-starting industrialisation in Britain. So you had this sort of beginnings of a new historiography, a much more holistic, much more complete one. And as you say, historians never rest. They're always looking for new interpretations. As a professional historian, you're going to get a book published unless it says something new in the eyes of its reviewers. So history is not just never a static subject. And the fact that you had this wealth of approaches, of insights, of subjects to do with the transformations that empire brought, nationalists find unsettling. It's unsettling to hear that your ancestors went through an industrial revolution not solely because of British genius or because there was coal under the ground or iron ore under the ground in Britain, but partly through their quite barbaric exploitation of millions of people in the slave trade and slave ownership in the Caribbean. That's not a sort of flattering and comforting narrative for a nationalist to hear. So a lot of this backlash comes from that.
And it's that narrative coming under threat that generates a lot of anger, I suppose. You mentioned that kind of period of historiography where the question was, how did the empire grow and how was it administered? And the way that perhaps it would have been taught in schools in the 1960s or 70s was, wow, that was pretty clever of us. We created this thing, and through a combination of weakness and folly, we let it go, and here we are. And that's the kind of the mental map for, there's probably a generation now, I would imagine, in their 50s and 60s, their mental map is kind of that thing they were taught of, as far as I'm aware, we did this amazing thing. We had the biggest empire in the world. And there was that question of British ingenuity, of, Brunel, and, here I'm talking to you from South Wales, where the coal came down from the valleys into the ships in Cardiff and around the world, and our industrial past, and was our world power status not the product of just good old ingenuity and cleverness? And the answer is, well, it's not the product of that, but there is a whole other side to things as well, and this. The great argument that kind of advocates for British imperialism put forward is, well, we weren't the Belgians, we weren't King Leopold, we didn't do what the Germans did to the Herero people. But there's a small question of things like what happened in Tasmania, and a variety of other things. I guess this battle to defend the memory of the empire, a positive version of the memory of the empire, really is about how generations of British people have seen themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been some work by political psychologists on how people respond when the narratives that they've kind of internalized and which mean a lot to them in terms of their personal identity are challenged. And one of the findings is that this deflection, this whataboutery, is a very common and appealing initial response, an immediate response.
Yeah.
So, if you're told that it was Britons in the past who were responsible for the genocide of Aboriginal Tasmanians, you immediately deflect to the Herero and what the Germans did. Or if you're told that Britain was refined the transatlantic slave trade, the shipping of, in Britain's case, 3 million, but in total about 12 million people from one continent to another, which completely transformed both continents and created much of the basis for modernity. If you're told that, the response is, well, the Romans had slaves, or the Barbary pirates captured European slaves.
Yeah.
And you can get drawn into these rabbit holes of, as I've done on Twitter a number of times, pointing out how these episodes are different, or you can just say, yes, that's true, but let's come back to what we were talking about, which was British imperial history. I think the first thing is to recognize that it is a deflection tactic. David Olusoga, probably the most prominent Black historian, has talked about how whenever he tries to talk about hidden histories of Britain or histories which should be better known, whataboutery is the first response, and it is a deflection technique. So kind of psychologically comforting technique. And I think as someone myself, I was brought up to hold these national myths quite dearly. I'm still proud to be British, despite all I know about the exploitation of the past. It doesn't undermine the fact that I'm British, and I have no problem with that identity. It's not anti-British to know this stuff.
No.
But I, as someone who was raised with these kind of these myths and ideas and watched all the imperial nostalgia films, it was Zulu that first got me interested in empire. I can understand those kind of immediate psychological reactions. You feel confronted, you feel challenged. But I think there's something else going on as well. I think you hinted earlier at the distinction between those who are actively promoting these kind of culture war denials and justifications and mitigations for what went on in the colonial past, and those who, most of us, simply haven't been taught about the imperial past. We don't know much about it, and so we're sort of susceptible to some of these denials. And I think there's another thing we need to understand in terms of where these denials are coming from, where they're being platformed in the right-wing press and Conservative MPs. There's also a kind of short-term electoral politics at play here. It's not just the deeper emotional triggers that are being hit. There's a certain faction, the Brexiteerian faction of the Conservative Party, who think that culture war is the best means of retaining the so-called red wall seats. So again, outside Britain, in the last general election in 2019, the Conservative Party did very well in former Labour supporting mostly Midlands and Northern constituencies on the basis of Brexit. And the slogan was "Get Brexit Done," because the majority of people in those seats had voted for Brexit. And Boris Johnson and the sort of extreme patriotic fringe of the party promised that they would get Brexit done and that they would what's called level up, so bring more investment to these communities. Both of those things have failed to help. Brexit has been detrimental to economic development rather than promoting of it. There's been no investment really to speak of in levelling up. And so culture war, sort of mobilizing people around their patriotism and around this idea that the woke left is threatening Britishness by trashing our past, besmirching our heroes, undermining our national identity. There is a clear electoral politics behind that too.
I wonder if that actually, you could actually almost trace that back to 2008 when the kind of the model of economics that had been dominant since Margaret Thatcher and had been embraced basically by both parties blew up, probably never to kind of fully function again as it had done. And so the Conservatives, who were on the ascendancy at that moment, knew that really they have austerity to offer, which isn't a particularly attractive thing to anybody. But there were voices within the party saying, well, if we can't trade on economics any longer, all we have is sort of reduced expectations, perhaps culture and identity are the ways you win elections now. And arguably they have been successful in that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And they've been explicit about it. This isn't just sort of conjecture on our part. So I mentioned before, there's a group of over 50 Conservative MPs who called themselves the Common Sense Group, and who actually published a manifesto. And in that manifesto, one of the chapters is entitled Turning the Red Wall Blue for Years to Come, or some such title. And they're very explicit there that social conservatism, anti-wokery, basically, is the most appealing electoral tactic that is left after Brexit. And there's varying sort of contributions to this group, but some of it is pretty scarily radical, in terms of its right-wing approach. Leaving the European Convention on Human Rights was part of that immediately, even before the boat crisis and Miranda and so on. We're talking about that. And talking about a new social contract, using some of the terminology that fascists used in the 1930s about a revival, a national revival and reawakening. So there is this kind of a agenda, which I think partly explains the very prominent and well-funded platforms that are carrying this stuff. Some very well-connected people behind it. But it's an interaction between that sort of driven politics and people's general predisposition to want comforting narratives about the past, which makes them susceptible to these ideas, I think.
Well, there we must leave things, Alan. It's been a pleasure to chat with you today, and I do hope we can continue this conversation at some point in the future. All the very best with the workshop. It sounds like it's kind of really, really important stuff that you're disseminating beyond academia and towards the folks that are going to be, fighting those culture battles for a long time to come. So thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
And we'll hopefully speak again. Take good care.
Yeah, thanks very much, Nick. Bye-bye.